The man who would become one of the most notorious figures in Essex's criminal underworld was born on the 18th of September, 1955, as Anthony Tucker in the town of Basildon, in the county of Essex, in southeastern England. His father was Edward Tucker, a factory worker who spent most of his working life employed in the industrial estates which had sprung up across southern Essex in the decades following the Second World War. Anthony's mother was Patricia Tucker, who, in addition to raising their 3 children, also worked part-time as a shop assistant in Basildon town centre. Although Anthony, who would become known as Tony, was born in Basildon, the town itself had only recently come into existence. It is worth reflecting on the development of this Essex new town, with which Tucker would become so intrinsically associated. The site had been predominantly agricultural land until the late 1940s, when the British government, as part of the New Towns Act of 1946, designated the area for development to accommodate London's growing population and alleviate the capital's severe housing shortage in the aftermath of the war. Construction began in earnest in 1949, and the town grew rapidly over the 2 decades that followed. The population increased from approximately 25,000 people in the mid-1950s, when Tony was born, to over 100,000 by the time he entered his teenage years in the late 1960s, driven by Basildon's development as a centre of light industry and manufacturing. And this growth did not stop there. By the time Tony entered his early 20s, in the mid-1970s, the population of Basildon had increased to over 150,000 people, while the wider county of Essex, which lies immediately to the east of London and stretches to the North Sea coast, had seen its population grow from approximately 2 million people in 1950 to over 3 million by this time. Basildon and the surrounding towns in southern Essex had become part of London's commuter belt, connected to the capital by major road and rail links, while the area also benefited from proximity to Tilbury docks and other port facilities along the Thames estuary. The rapid expansion of the region in the 1950s and 1960s brought with it the usual problems associated with hastily constructed new towns, including a lack of adequate social infrastructure, high unemployment among young people, and areas of deprivation which existed alongside the new housing estates and industrial developments. And it was in this environment that Tony Tucker grew up in the 1960s and early 1970s. The family lived on one of Basildon's large housing estates, and Tony attended local comprehensive schools, though he showed little interest in academic pursuits. Instead, he became involved in petty criminality from an early age, including theft, vandalism, and fights with other youths in the area. By the time he was 14 years old, he had already been cautioned by police on several occasions and was developing a reputation among his peers for aggressive behavior and a willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. And by his mid-teens, Tucker had been involved in several more serious incidents which resulted in arrests, including assault and theft charges. He left school at the age of 16 with no qualifications and drifted between various manual labor jobs while continuing to engage in criminal activities with other young men in Basildon who were similarly inclined. By the time Tony was in his late teens, he had already served short sentences in youth detention facilities and was well known to local police as a habitual offender and troublemaker. In the early 1970s, as Tony entered his late teens, he began to associate with other young men in Basildon who were similarly involved in acts of theft, assault, and various forms of petty criminality. Tucker's criminal record expanded significantly during this period, with multiple convictions for assault, theft of motor vehicles, and possession of offensive weapons. In 1973, at the age of 18, he was sentenced to his first substantial prison term, serving 9 months in a young offenders institution for his involvement in a violent assault outside a public house in Basildon. Prison did little to deter Tucker from his criminal activities. Upon his release in 1974, he returned to Basildon and continued to engage in the same pattern of behavior which had led to his imprisonment in the first place. However, Tucker's interests were beginning to shift from opportunistic petty crime towards more organized and lucrative activities. He became involved in the trade of stolen goods, operating as a fence for other criminals in the area, and also began to engage in more serious acts of violence for hire. During this period, Tucker also discovered bodybuilding and began using anabolic steroids to enhance his physical development. By the mid-1970s, he had built a considerable physique, and his imposing physical presence, combined with his growing reputation for violence, made him a valuable asset in the world of nightclub security. Tucker began working as a doorman at various pubs and nightclubs across Essex, a position which would prove crucial to his future criminal enterprises. The work provided Tucker with a legitimate income, albeit a modest one, but more importantly, it gave him access to the nightlife economy of Essex and introduced him to other individuals who were operating on the edges of legality. Many of the doormen and security personnel working in Essex during this period were involved in criminal activities, and the control of door security at popular venues often meant control over other illegal activities taking place within those establishments, including the sale of drugs and the running of protection rackets. And it was through his work in nightclub security that Tucker met two individuals who would become his closest associates in the years to come. The first was Patrick Tate, known as Pat, who was born on the 2nd of November 1965 in Walthamstow, in the London borough of Waltham Forest. Tate was 10 years younger than Tucker, but had already established a reputation for extreme violence despite his youth. He had grown up in a troubled household and had been involved in criminal activities from his early teenage years, including robbery, assault, and drug dealing. Tate's background was similar to Tucker's in many respects. His father had largely been absent from his life, and his mother had struggled to raise him and his siblings in difficult circumstances. By the time he was 16, Tate had already served time in youth detention and was known to police as a dangerous and unpredictable individual. Like Tucker, Tate was also heavily involved in bodybuilding and steroid use, which contributed to his aggressive behavior and volatile temperament. The second key associate was Craig Rolfe, who was born on the 31st of December 1963 in Dagenham, in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham. Rolfe was less physically imposing than Tucker or Tate, but he possessed a different set of skills, which would prove valuable to their future operations. He had been involved in motor vehicle theft from a young age and had developed considerable expertise in stealing and reselling cars, a criminal activity which was particularly prevalent in Essex and the surrounding areas in the 1970s and early 1980s. Working in association with Tucker and Tate, Rolfe would eventually become the business-minded member of the group, handling financial matters and logistics, while Tucker and Tate focused on the more violent aspects of their operations. However, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the three men first became acquainted, they were still operating as relatively small-time criminals engaged in various forms of theft, violence, and drug dealing. Tucker continued to work as a doorman throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, building both his reputation and his network of criminal contacts. He worked at venues across Essex, including nightclubs in Basildon, Southend-on-Sea, and other towns in the region. The door security work also provided Tucker with opportunities to deal in anabolic steroids, which were increasingly popular among bodybuilders and fitness enthusiasts during this period, and he began to make substantial sums of money from this trade in addition to his doorman wages. And the steroid trade introduced Tucker to the wider world of drug dealing, a business which was becoming increasingly lucrative in Britain in the early 1980s. While marijuana and heroin had been the dominant illegal drugs in Britain throughout the 1960s and 1970s, new substances were beginning to appear on the market, and the infrastructure for importing and distributing these drugs was still being established by criminal organizations across the country. Tucker's involvement in violent crime also escalated during this period. In 1981, he was arrested and charged with causing grievous bodily harm after a particularly brutal assault on a rival doorman at a nightclub in Southend-on-Sea. The victim had been attempting to muscle in on Tucker's territory, and Tucker's response was characteristically violent and disproportionate. The man suffered severe facial injuries and a broken jaw, requiring extensive medical treatment and reconstructive surgery. Tucker was convicted and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, of which he served 2 before being released in 1983. This prison sentence was significant not only because of its length, but also because of the connections Tucker made while incarcerated. He met other criminals who were involved in more sophisticated operations than the street-level violence and petty theft, which had characterized much of his criminal career up to that point. Upon his release in 1983, Tucker returned to Essex and resumed his activities with renewed ambition. He reconnected with Tate and Rolfe, and the 3 men began to work together more systematically. Combining Tucker's reputation and physical presence, Tate's willingness to engage in extreme violence, and Rolfe's business acumen and technical skills. The early 1980s were a period of significant change in Britain. The country was in the midst of the Thatcher government's economic reforms, which had led to deindustrialization in many areas and high unemployment, particularly among young working-class men in regions such as Essex. The social fabric of many communities was under strain, and this created both opportunities and recruits for criminal enterprises. And Tucker was well positioned to take advantage of these conditions. He and his associates continued to control door security at several venues across Essex, and they expanded their involvement in the steroid trade, establishing connections with suppliers who could provide them with bulk quantities of anabolic steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs. They also began to engage in more serious forms of criminality, including armed robbery and the running of protection rackets targeting local businesses. In 1985, Tucker was involved in an armed robbery of a security van in Basildon, though he was never charged with this crime due to a lack of evidence. The robbery netted approximately £50,000, a substantial sum at the time, and this money was used to further expand the group's operations. They invested in additional nightclub security contracts and also began to acquire firearms, which they used both for robberies and to intimidate rivals and enforce their control over their territory. The culture of violence in Essex during this period was notable even by the standards of organized crime in Britain. Tucker and his associates were known for their willingness to use extreme and gratuitous violence, not only against rivals, but also against anyone who was perceived as disrespecting them or interfering with their activities. This reputation served them well in establishing dominance over their criminal territory, as few were willing to challenge individuals who had demonstrated such a capacity for brutality. Pat Tate, in particular, had developed a reputation as perhaps the most dangerous member of the group. In 1986, when he was just 21 years old, Tate was involved in a violent incident outside a nightclub in Ilford, which resulted in a man being hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. Tate was arrested and charged with grievous bodily harm. But the case collapsed when witnesses refused to testify, almost certainly due to intimidation. And this pattern would repeat itself multiple times over the years that followed. Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe were arrested on numerous occasions throughout the mid to late 1980s for various offenses, including assault, robbery, and weapons possession. But convictions were difficult to secure due to the climate of fear they had created. Witnesses were reluctant to come forward, and those who did often recanted their statements before cases came to trial. By the late 1980s, Tucker had established himself as one of the most significant figures in Essex's criminal underworld. He controlled door security at a dozen or more nightclubs and pubs across the region. He was heavily involved in the steroid trade, and he and his associates had access to a substantial arsenal of firearms. The group was generating significant income from their various criminal enterprises, and Tucker was living a lifestyle far beyond what would have been possible through legitimate employment. He had acquired property in Basildon, drove expensive cars, and spent money freely on clothes, holidays, and other luxury goods. And while he maintained the facade of being a legitimate nightclub security operative, everyone in Essex's criminal circles knew that Tucker was a major player in organized crime and that crossing him could have severe and potentially fatal consequences. Tucker's reputation for violence and his connections in Essex's nightlife would prove valuable as a new cultural phenomenon was about to emerge, one which would provide unprecedented opportunities for individuals such as Tucker and his associates. In the late 1980s, a transformation was occurring across Britain, and particularly in the counties surrounding London, one which would provide unprecedented opportunities for individuals such as Tucker and his associates. This transformation had its origins in the music and club scenes of Chicago and Detroit in the United States, where a new form of electronic dance music had emerged in the early to mid-1980s. The music, characterized by repetitive electronic beats, synthesized sounds, and extended instrumental passages designed for dancing rather than listening, had begun to cross the Atlantic and find audiences in British clubs by 1987. The movement, which would become known as Acid House, arrived in Britain through a combination of British DJs and club promoters who had experienced the scene in Ibiza, the Spanish island, which had become a popular holiday destination for young Britons, and through imports of records from American producers. By the summer of 1987, a small number of clubs in London and Manchester were hosting nights dedicated to this new sound, and the music was beginning to attract a devoted following among young people who found the existing British club scene stale and uninspiring. However, it was not merely the music which made acid house distinctive. The scene was inextricably linked to the use of a drug known as MDMA, or 3,4-methylene dioxide methamphetamine, which was more commonly referred to by its street name, ecstasy. MDMA had been synthesized as early as 1912 and had seen limited use in psychiatric therapy in the 1970s, but by the mid-1980s, it had found its way into the American club scene, where it was valued for its euphoric and empathogenic effects. Users of ecstasy reported feelings of intense well-being, emotional openness, and heightened sensory perception, particularly of music and lights. The drug's effects made it ideally suited to the repetitive, hypnotic qualities of acid house music and the combination of MDMA and this new form of electronic dance music created an experience which devotees described as transcendent and unlike anything available in traditional nightclubs where alcohol was the primary intoxicant. And by 1988, acid house had exploded across Britain in what became known as the Second Summer of Love, a reference to the hippie movement of the 1960s. Thousands of young people across the country were attending club nights dedicated to the music, wearing distinctive clothing including bright colors, bandanas, and smiley face logos, and consuming large quantities of ecstasy. The movement had developed its own culture, its own fashion, and its own drug of choice, and it was spreading rapidly beyond the confines of licensed nightclubs. The transition from club-based events to large-scale illegal gatherings occurred because licensed venues had limited capacity and were subject to licensing laws which required them to close by 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. at the latest. Promoters and participants in the acid house scene wanted events which could continue through the night and into the following day, and so they began organizing raves in unlicensed venues such as empty warehouses, aircraft hangars, and open fields. These illegal raves were typically organized with minimal advance notice to avoid police intervention. Promoters would hire a venue or identify a suitable outdoor location, then disseminate information about the event through word of mouth and telephone information lines on the day of the event itself. Participants would gather at predetermined meeting points and then be directed to the actual location of the rave, often in convoys of vehicles numbering in the hundreds. The scale of these events grew rapidly throughout 1988 and 1989. Early raves might attract a few hundred participants, but by the summer of 1989, the largest events were drawing crowds of 10,000 to 25,000 people. One of the most significant organizers was a collective known as Sunrise, which held a series of massive raves across southern England. In June 1989, Sunrise organized an event near Sittingbourne in Kent, which attracted approximately 11,000 people, while another event in July near Great Bentley in Essex drew similar numbers. Essex was particularly significant in the development of rave culture. The county's proximity to London meant that it was easily accessible to the large population of the capital, while its relatively rural areas, particularly in the north and east of the county, provided suitable locations for large outdoor gatherings. The industrial estates and warehouse complexes in towns such as Basildon, Thurrock and Grays also offered venues for indoor raves which could accommodate thousands of participants. And the economic scale of these events was enormous, At the peak of the rave scene in 1989 and 1990, organizers were charging entry fees of $15 to £25 per person, meaning that a rave attracting 10,000 people could generate £150,000 to £250,000 in ticket sales alone. However, the real money was not in admission fees, but in the sale of ecstasy and other drugs within the venues. Ecstasy pills were typically sold for between $20 and $30 each at raves, while the wholesale cost to dealers was as low as $2 to £5 per pill, depending on quantity and source. A dealer selling just 100 pills at a single rave could make a profit of $2,000 to $2,500 in a single night, and the largest raves might see the sale of several thousand pills, generating tens of thousands of pounds in profits for those controlling the drug distribution. The demand for ecstasy was further driven by the physical nature of the raves themselves. Participants would dance for hours in crowded, often poorly ventilated spaces, and the stimulant properties of MDMA allowed them to maintain high levels of physical activity throughout the night. Users would typically consume multiple pills over the course of an event, further increasing the profits for dealers. However, the explosive growth of rave culture quickly attracted the attention of law enforcement. Police forces across southern England began attempting to shut down illegal raves, and there were regular confrontations between police and ravers throughout 1989 and 1990. In some cases, police managed to prevent raves from taking place by blocking roads and turning away convoys of vehicles, while in other instances they allowed events to proceed rather than risk public disorder by attempting to disperse thousands of people. The government's response to the rave phenomenon was to introduce new legislation. The Entertainment Act of 1990 gave local authorities greater powers to prevent unlicensed events, while the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 included specific provisions targeting raves, defining them as gatherings of 100 or more people at which amplified music, characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats, was played, and giving police powers to shut down such events and arrest organizers. But even as the legal framework was being tightened, the culture had already shifted. By the early 1990s, the rave scene was moving away from massive outdoor events towards smaller club-based gatherings and licensed venues. Nightclubs, which had initially resisted the acid house phenomenon, began to embrace it as they recognized the commercial opportunities, and many venues converted to playing electronic dance music and catering to the ecstasy-using clientele. This transition from illegal outdoor raves to licensed nightclub events created new opportunities for those who controlled nightclub security. If a security firm or individual controlled the doors of a venue, they effectively controlled who could enter the premises, including drug dealers. And by controlling which dealers were allowed to operate within a venue, door security personnel could demand payment from those dealers, or, more profitably, they could sell drugs themselves and use their position to prevent any competition. This was the situation which allowed established criminals, such as Tucker, to move into what was rapidly becoming one of the most lucrative drug markets in British history. Tucker's existing control over door security at multiple venues across Essex positioned him perfectly to take advantage of the rave culture phenomenon, and he quickly recognized that controlling security at these venues meant controlling access to a market where thousands of young people were willing to pay substantial sums for ecstasy every weekend. The environment in Essex was particularly conducive to this development. The county had become one of the centres of British rave culture, with numerous clubs and venues hosting regular events, and the demand for ecstasy was enormous and sustained. Criminal organisations which could establish control over drug distribution networks in Essex stood to make extraordinary profits, but such control required the capacity for violence and intimidation to prevent rivals from encroaching on the territory. Tucker and his associates quickly recognized that controlling security at nightclubs and raves across Essex meant controlling the drug market within them, and it was this realization which transformed them from local criminals into major drug traffickers. In the early 1990s, Tucker began to systematically take control of security operations at nightclubs and raves across Essex. His method was consistent and effective. He would identify venues which were attracting large numbers of customers and generating significant drug sales. Then, he would approach the venue owners or existing security firms and offer his services. If his offer was declined, the venue would typically experience a series of violent incidents, including assaults on customers, vandalism, and in some cases arson attempts, until the owners reconsidered their position. Working in association with Tate and Rolfe, Tucker assembled a team of doormen who were either experienced criminals themselves or individuals who were willing to engage in violence on Tucker's behalf. These men controlled access to the venues, decided who could enter and who would be refused admission, and most importantly, they determined which drug dealers would be allowed to operate inside the premises. One of the most significant venues which came under Tucker's control was Raquel's nightclub in Basildon, a large establishment which could hold over 1,000 people, and which had become one of the most popular nightlife destinations in southern Essex. Tucker and his associates took over security at Raquel's in 1990, and the venue quickly became a major centre for ecstasy distribution, with an estimated 500 to 1,000 pills being sold within the premises on busy weekend nights. The control of Raquel's and several other venues across Essex provided Tucker with a secure and extremely profitable base for drug distribution. Rather than relying on independent dealers who might be unpredictable or might attract police attention through careless behavior, Tucker's organization sold drugs directly to customers through dealers who were effectively employees of the security operation. These dealers would pay Tucker a fee for the privilege of operating within the venues, or in many cases, they would simply be supplied with drugs by Tucker and required to hand over a percentage of their takings, and the profits were substantial. By 1991, Tucker's operation was estimated to be generating at least $10,000 per week from drug sales alone, though the actual figure was likely considerably higher. This income came from multiple sources, including the sale of ecstasy at nightclubs, the distribution of anabolic steroids through gymnasiums and bodybuilding networks, and increasingly from the sale of cocaine, which was becoming more popular among affluent clubgoers in the early 1990s. The organization's success was built on several factors beyond Tucker's control of door security. Rolfe, who had developed considerable business acumen during his years involved in motor vehicle theft, took charge of the financial and logistical aspects of the operation. He managed relationships with drug suppliers, arranged for the transportation of drugs into Essex from sources in London and beyond, and oversaw the laundering of the organization's profits through various front businesses and property investments. Tate, meanwhile, served as the primary enforcer. His reputation for extreme and unpredictable violence was valuable in deterring potential rivals from attempting to encroach on the organization's territory. In 1991, Tate was involved in a particularly brutal assault on a rival drug dealer who had attempted to sell ecstasy at a venue controlled by Tucker. The man was attacked outside the club by Tate and several other members of Tucker's organization, suffering severe injuries, including a fractured skull and broken ribs. The victim survived but refused to cooperate with police, a pattern which would repeat itself numerous times over the years that followed. Tucker's organization had created an environment of fear in which rivals, victims of violence, and even witnesses to crimes were unwilling to provide evidence to law enforcement agencies. This climate of intimidation extended to venue owners and other legitimate business operators who might have been inclined to resist Tucker's takeover of their security operations. Tucker's increasing wealth was reflected in his lifestyle. He acquired multiple properties in Essex, including a substantial house in an affluent area of Basildon, and he owned several expensive vehicles, including a Range Rover and a Porsche. He wore expensive clothing and jewelry and spent money freely on holidays and entertainment. And while Tucker made some efforts to present a legitimate facade through ownership of security firms and other businesses, few in Essex were under any illusions about the true source of his wealth. The organization also expanded its activities beyond drug distribution. Tucker and his associates continued to engage in armed robberies, though these became less frequent as their drug-related income increased. They also ran protection rackets, demanding payment from businesses in exchange for protection from vandalism and violence. Protection which Tucker's organization was often perfectly positioned to provide, given that they controlled much of the criminal activity in their territory. However, the expansion of Tucker's operations inevitably brought increased attention from law enforcement. Essex police were well aware of Tucker's activities and had been attempting to build cases against him throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Officers conducted surveillance operations, cultivated informants, and made numerous arrests of low-level members of the organization, but securing convictions against Tucker himself or his senior associates proved difficult due to the combination of witness intimidation and the organization's operational security. The organization's relationship with police was complex. There were allegations, though never proven in court, that some police officers in Essex had been corrupted by Tucker's organization, accepting payments in exchange for providing information about investigations or for overlooking certain criminal activities. At a minimum, it was clear that Tucker had sources of information within law enforcement, which allowed him to anticipate police operations and take precautions. And the organization's access to firearms added another dimension to their operations. Tucker, Tate, and other members of the group possessed a variety of weapons, including handguns and shotguns, which they used both for intimidation and in some cases for acts of violence. In 1992, shots were fired at a rival's vehicle in Basildon, though no one was injured in the incident and no arrests were made. The early 1990s represented the period during which Tucker and his associates, who had become known collectively as the Essex Boys throughout the criminal underworld of southern England, consolidated their control over drug distribution in nightclubs and raves across Essex. They had effectively created a criminal enterprise which generated enormous profits through a combination of violence, intimidation, and strategic control of key venues. By 1993, the Essex Boys had established themselves as one of the most significant criminal organizations operating in the region. They controlled security at a dozen or more venues. They had reliable sources of drug supply. They had eliminated or intimidated most potential rivals, and they were generating weekly profits that put them among the wealthiest criminals in Essex. Tucker's operation was now generating substantial sums of money every week, but with this success came increased attention from both rival criminal organizations and law enforcement agencies who were becoming increasingly determined to dismantle what had become one of the most profitable drug distribution networks in southern England. By 1993, the Essex Boys, as Tucker and his associates had become known throughout the criminal underworld of southern England, were at the peak of their wealth and influence. The organization controlled door security at approximately 15 nightclubs and other entertainment venues across Essex, stretching from Basildon and Southend-on-Sea in the south to Colchester in the northeast of the county. Each venue generated drug sales every weekend, with the larger establishments such as Raquel's in Basildon moving between 500 and 1,000 ecstasy pills on busy nights. The scale of the operation's drug distribution network had expanded considerably from its origins in the early 1990s. In addition to ecstasy, which remained the primary source of income, the organization was also distributing significant quantities of cocaine, amphetamines, and cannabis. The cocaine trade was particularly profitable, with the drug fetching prices of $40 to £60 per gram at retail level, while wholesale quantities could be acquired for as little as $20 to £25 per gram. Conservative estimates suggested that the Essex Boys were generating between $50,000 and £75,000 per week from drug sales across all their venues and distribution networks. Over the course of a year, this amounted to between $2.5 million and $4 million in gross revenue, though the actual profit margins varied considerably depending on the costs of acquiring drugs from suppliers, payments to dealers and other members of the organization, and the substantial sums spent on maintaining their operations and lifestyle. Tucker's personal wealth, by this time, was considerable. He owned multiple properties in Essex, including his primary residence in Basildon, a flat in Southend-on-Sea which he used as a base for operations in that area, and investment properties which generated rental income. His collection of vehicles included a Range Rover, a Porsche 911, and a Mercedes-Benz, while he also owned motorcycles and other luxury items. The lifestyle which Tucker and his closest associates enjoyed was characterized by conspicuous consumption. They frequented expensive restaurants, took holidays to Spain and other European destinations, and spent freely on designer clothing, jewelry, and other status symbols. Tucker, in particular, was known for wearing expensive watches and gold jewelry, and for carrying large amounts of cash which he would use to pay for purchases and entertainment. However, the period of 1993 to 1994 also saw the emergence of several problems which would ultimately contribute to the organization's downfall. The first of these occurred in May 1993, when Pat Tate was arrested following a violent incident at a nightclub in Basildon. Tate had been involved in an altercation with a group of men who had allegedly disrespected him, and the confrontation had escalated into a serious assault in which one of the victims suffered a broken jaw and severe facial injuries. Tate was charged with grievous bodily harm, and despite Tucker's attempts to interfere with the case through witness intimidation, there was sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. In October 1993, Tate was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment and was sent to serve his sentence at a prison in Essex. His absence from the organization created both operational and psychological challenges for Tucker and Rolfe. Tate had served as the primary enforcer for the Essex boys, and his reputation for extreme violence had been crucial in deterring rivals from attempting to encroach on their territory. With Tate imprisoned, Tucker and Rolfe had to rely on other members of the organization to provide the same level of intimidation. And while there were several capable individuals available, none possessed quite the same combination of volatility and ruthlessness which had made Tate so effective. And Tate's imprisonment also marked the beginning of a period during which Tucker's own behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning to those around him. Tucker had been using cocaine recreationally for several years, but by 1993, his use had escalated to the point where he was consuming substantial quantities of the drug on a regular basis. Cocaine use, particularly in the quantities Tucker was consuming, can produce symptoms including paranoia, aggression, and impaired judgment, and these effects were becoming evident in Tucker's conduct. Tucker became increasingly suspicious of associates, rivals, and even friends, convinced that various individuals were plotting against him or attempting to steal from the organization. He would make accusations without evidence, and in some cases, these accusations led to violent confrontations. On one occasion, in late 1993, Tucker accused a longtime associate of providing information to police, an accusation which was almost certainly unfounded, and the man was subjected to a severe beating by Tucker and other members of the organization. The combination of cocaine and anabolic steroids, which Tucker continued to use in large quantities, created a particularly volatile psychological state. Anabolic steroids are known to produce increased aggression and mood swings, effects which are sometimes referred to colloquially as roid rage, and when combined with the paranoia and agitation produced by cocaine use, the result was a personality which was unpredictable and dangerous even to those within Tucker's own organization. Rolfe, who was more level-headed and less inclined towards violence than Tucker or Tate, became increasingly concerned about Tucker's behavior during this period. However, Rolfe's influence within the organization was limited, and he was unable to moderate Tucker's conduct or convince him to reduce his drug consumption. The dynamic within the Essex boys had always placed Tucker at the top of the hierarchy due to his reputation and his willingness to use violence, and challenging his decisions or behavior was not a realistic option. Meanwhile, the organization's operations continued to generate substantial profits. The demand for ecstasy and other drugs showed no signs of diminishing, and the venues controlled by the Essex boys remained among the most popular nightlife destinations in Essex. However, the very success of the organization was creating its own problems. The enormous sums of money being generated by drug sales required laundering, and this process became increasingly complex as the amounts involved grew larger. The organization used various methods to launder money, including purchasing property, investing in legitimate businesses, and in some cases, simply hiding large quantities of cash in safe houses and other secure locations. However, each of these methods carried risks, and the sheer volume of cash being generated meant that large sums remained vulnerable to seizure or theft. The organization's relationship with its drug suppliers also became more complicated during this period. Tucker and his associates were purchasing drugs from several different suppliers, some based in London and others with connections to importers who brought drugs into Britain from continental Europe and beyond. These suppliers were themselves serious criminals who operated their own organizations and who expected payment on time and in full. In late 1993, a dispute arose between Tucker and one of his primary cocaine suppliers over the quality of a batch of cocaine, which the Essex boys had purchased. Tucker claimed that the cocaine had been heavily adulterated with other substances and demanded a refund or replacement, while the supplier insisted that the quality had been consistent with previous shipments and that payment was still owed. The disagreement was eventually resolved through the intervention of mutual associates, but the incident created tension in a relationship which had previously been relatively stable. Tucker's reputation for violence, which had served him so well in establishing and maintaining control over his territory in Essex, also meant that he had numerous enemies throughout the criminal underworld of southern England. Individuals who had been assaulted, threatened, or otherwise victimized by Tucker and his associates harbored grudges which could potentially develop into more serious conflicts. And while the Essex boys' capacity for violence had generally been sufficient to deter retaliation, there was always the possibility that a rival organization or group of individuals might decide that the potential rewards of challenging Tucker outweighed the risks. Law enforcement attention on the organization also intensified during 1993 and 1994. Essex police had established a dedicated unit to investigate organized crime in the county, and the Essex boys were a primary target of this unit's operations. Police conducted surveillance on Tucker, Rolfe, and other members of the organization, monitored their communications where possible, and attempted to cultivate informants who might provide evidence that could be used to secure convictions. However, the organization's operational security remained relatively effective. Tucker and his associates were careful about what they discussed over telephones. They conducted sensitive business in person rather than through electronic communications, and they maintained the climate of fear which made potential informants reluctant to cooperate with police. As a result, while police gathered significant intelligence about the organization's activities, converting this intelligence into evidence which could be presented in court proved challenging. Tucker made some efforts during this period to create a more legitimate facade for his activities. He established security companies which ostensibly provided lawful door security services to nightclubs and other venues, and he invested in other businesses including property development and vehicle sales. These businesses provided a degree of cover for his criminal activities and also served as vehicles for laundering drug profits. However, few people who dealt with Tucker were under any illusions about the true nature of his business. the amounts of money he was spending, the lifestyle he was living, and his known associates all made it clear that his wealth came primarily from criminal enterprises rather than from legitimate business operations. And while the legitimate businesses provided some protection from law enforcement scrutiny, they also created additional complexity and potential vulnerabilities in the form of business records, tax obligations, and other documentation which could potentially be used as evidence in criminal prosecutions. By early 1994, approximately 1 year into Pat Tate's prison sentence, Tucker was becoming increasingly impatient for his associate's release. He believed that Tate's return would help to stabilize the organization and restore the particularly fearsome reputation which the Essex boys had enjoyed when all 3 principal members were operating together. However, Tate's behavior in prison was causing concern. Reports from visitors and from other inmates suggested that Tate was becoming even more volatile and unpredictable during his incarceration. He was involved in several violent incidents within the prison. He was using drugs including steroids which were being smuggled into the facility, and he was making threats against various individuals whom he believed had contributed to his conviction. These reports suggested that when Tate was eventually released, he might prove to be an even more unstable and dangerous presence than he had been before his imprisonment. The combination of Tate's imprisonment, Tucker's increasing paranoia and cocaine addiction, growing tensions with suppliers, and the inevitable attention that came with operating such a high-profile criminal organization meant that the Essex boys' dominance in the Essex drug trade could not continue indefinitely without significant challenges emerging. In early 1995, Pat Tate was released from prison after serving approximately 18 months of his 2-year sentence. His release was eagerly anticipated by Tucker, who believed that Tate's return would restore the organization's fearsome reputation and help to consolidate their control over Essex's drug trade. However, Tate's time in prison had changed him in ways which would prove problematic for the Essex boys. Tate emerged from his incarceration even more volatile and unpredictable than he had been before his imprisonment. He had continued to use anabolic steroids heavily while in prison, obtaining them through networks of corrupt guards and other inmates, and his steroid abuse had intensified the aggressive and paranoid tendencies which had always been part of his personality. Associates who encountered Tate shortly after his release reported that he seemed more suspicious, more quick to anger, and more willing to resort to extreme violence over minor provocations. And Tate's return coincided with a period during which the Essex boys were facing increasing pressure from multiple directions. The first major crisis occurred in the spring of 1995 when a dispute arose between Tucker's organization and their primary cocaine supplier. The exact nature of the disagreement remains contested, with different accounts providing varying details. But the core issue involved either a large drug debt, which Tucker and his associates allegedly owed to the supplier, or alternatively, a cocaine shipment which had gone missing and for which the supplier held Tucker responsible. The amounts involved were substantial, with estimates ranging from $50,000 to over £100,000, depending on the source. The supplier, who was connected to a major criminal organization operating in London and the southeast of England, demanded payment and made it clear that failure to settle the debt would have serious consequences. Tucker, for his part, refused to accept responsibility for the missing drugs or the debt, claiming that he had been cheated or set up by the supplier or by intermediaries. This conflict created a dangerous situation for the Essex boys. They were now at odds with a criminal organization which was considerably larger and more powerful than their own operation, and which had the capacity to mobilize significant resources and manpower if the dispute escalated into open violence. Tucker's usual response to threats would have been to meet them with overwhelming force, but in this case, such an approach risked provoking a war which the Essex boys were unlikely to win. The tensions with the cocaine supplier were compounded by other developments which occurred throughout 1995. Several other criminal figures in Essex and London who had previously been intimidated by Tucker's reputation began to sense that the Essex boys were vulnerable, and there were reports of various individuals making threats or attempting to move into territory which Tucker considered his own. One individual who became involved with the Essex boys during this period was Darren Nichols, a criminal associate who had connections to various figures in Essex's underworld. Nichols, who was born in 1965 and had a lengthy criminal record, including convictions for theft and handling stolen goods, became a driver and general assistant to Tucker's organization in 1995. His involvement would later prove significant in ways which no one anticipated at the time. Meanwhile, Tucker's cocaine use had reached levels which were affecting his judgment and behavior in increasingly obvious ways. He was consuming several grams of cocaine per day by mid-1995, spending hundreds of pounds per week on the drug despite having essentially unlimited access to cocaine through his own distribution network. His paranoia intensified to the point where he suspected almost everyone around him of plotting against him or stealing from the organization. Rolf, who had always been the most cautious and business-minded member of the Essex boys, became increasingly alarmed by Tucker's behavior and by the various threats which were accumulating around the organization. However, Rolf lacked the authority within the group to challenge Tucker's decisions or to moderate the aggressive approach which Tucker and Tate favored when dealing with threats. Then, on the 11th of November 1995, an event occurred which dramatically increased the pressure on all drug dealers and traffickers operating in Essex and across Britain. Leah Betts, an 18-year-old woman from the Essex town of Latchington, died after taking an ecstasy pill at her birthday party. Her death, which was caused by water intoxication resulting from the advice commonly given to ecstasy users to drink large amounts of water, generated enormous media coverage and public outcry. Leah Betts became the face of anti-drug campaigns across Britain, and her death prompted renewed determination from law enforcement agencies to target those responsible for manufacturing, importing, and distributing ecstasy. Essex police came under particular pressure given that Betts was a local resident and that Essex had been such a significant centre of rave culture and ecstasy use throughout the early 1990s. The investigation into the source of the pill which killed Betts eventually traced it back to a dealer who had connections to Tucker's organization, though Tucker himself was never directly implicated in the supply chain. However, the intense media scrutiny and the stepped-up police operations which followed Betts' death made the environment considerably more dangerous for drug dealers throughout Essex. and the Essex boys found that their activities were now being watched more closely than ever before. And the combination of all these pressures created a situation in which Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe were facing threats from their cocaine suppliers who were demanding payment of a disputed debt, from rival criminal figures who sensed vulnerability, from law enforcement agencies which were intensifying their efforts to shut down drug distribution networks, and from their own increasingly erratic behavior and poor decision-making. Associates of the Essex boys later reported that during November and early December of 1995, both Tucker and Tate seemed aware that they were in danger, but appeared unable or unwilling to take effective precautions. They continued to conduct business as usual, meeting with associates and rivals, traveling to and from venues they controlled, and making little effort to vary their routines or enhance their security, despite receiving information that threats against them were being made by various individuals. By early December 1995, Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe were facing threats from multiple directions, yet they continued to conduct their business with little apparent concern for the dangers surrounding them. On the evening of the 6th of December 1995, Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe drove in Tucker's blue Range Rover to a meeting in the village of Rettendon in Essex. Rettendon is a small rural village located approximately 8 miles southeast of the town of Chelmsford in central Essex, surrounded by farmland and accessible primarily by narrow country lanes. The three men were travelling to meet individuals with whom they had business, though the exact nature and purpose of the meeting has remained a subject of dispute in the years since. Tucker was driving the Range Rover, with Tate in the front passenger seat and Rolfe sitting in the rear of the vehicle. They drove along Workhouse Lane, a remote farm track on the outskirts of Rettendon, which was bordered by fields and had no nearby residences. It was dark, and the lane was unlit, making it an isolated location even by the standards of rural Essex. What happened next occurred quickly and at close range. As the Range Rover came to a stop along Workhouse Lane, one or more individuals approached the vehicle and opened fire with a pump-action shotgun. Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe were all shot multiple times at point-blank range while still inside the vehicle. Tucker was killed by shots to his head and upper body. Tate died from wounds to his head and torso, and Rolfe, who was sitting in the rear, was also killed by shotgun blasts to his head and body. The three men died almost instantly. The interior of the Range Rover was left covered in blood, and the windows of the vehicle were shattered by the shotgun blasts. The killer or killers then left the scene, leaving the vehicle with the three bodies inside it, parked on the isolated farm track. The murders were not discovered until the following morning. On the 7th of December 1995, a farmer who was checking on fields in the area noticed the Range Rover parked on Workhouse Lane, and upon approaching the vehicle, observed that something was severely wrong. He contacted Essex police, and officers arrived at the scene shortly before midday. The discovery of the three bodies generated an immediate and massive police response. Senior officers from Essex Police quickly recognized that this was not a random act of violence, but rather an execution which had been carefully planned and carried out with precision. The remote location, the use of shotguns at close range, and the fact that all three victims had been killed while still in their vehicle suggested that the murders had been carried out by individuals with criminal experience. Essex police established a major incident room and assigned dozens of detectives to what became known as Operation Sentry, one of the largest murder investigations in the force's history. The scene at Workhouse Lane was secured, and forensic teams began the painstaking process of gathering evidence from the Range Rover and the surrounding area. News of the murders spread rapidly through Essex's criminal underworld, and within hours had reached the wider public through media reports. The deaths of Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe, who were well-known figures in Essex, both for their control of nightclub security and for their criminal activities, generated enormous interest and speculation. Theories about who might have been responsible for the killings began to circulate almost immediately, with various individuals and organizations being identified as potential suspects by those familiar with the Essex boys and their activities. The media coverage of the murders was extensive. National newspapers and television news programs reported on the killings, describing them as an execution-style gangland slaying and providing background information on the victims and their involvement in organized crime in Essex. The Rettendon murders, as they quickly became known, were presented as evidence of the violent criminal underworld which existed beneath the surface of apparently ordinary English towns and villages. For residents of Essex, and particularly those who were familiar with the nightlife scene in which Tucker and his associates had operated, the murders were both shocking and, in some sense, inevitable. Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe had built their criminal empire on violence and intimidation, and many observers noted that they had ultimately died in the same manner which they had used to control others throughout their criminal careers. The murders sent shockwaves through Essex's criminal underworld and marked the end of the Essex Boys as a criminal organization. But they were only the beginning of a complex investigation which would take over a year to produce arrests and would generate controversy which continues to the present day. In the weeks and months that followed the murders, Essex police initiated one of the largest investigations in the force's history, an operation which would come to be known as Operation Century. Senior detectives were assigned to lead the investigation, and over 50 officers were dedicated to the case, conducting interviews, gathering forensic evidence, and attempting to piece together the events which had led to the deaths of Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe. The initial phase of the investigation focused on identifying potential suspects from among the numerous individuals and organizations which had conflicts with the Essex Boys. The list of people who might have had motives to kill Tucker and his associates was lengthy, including rival drug dealers, individuals who had been victimized by the Essex Boys' violence, the cocaine suppliers with whom Tucker had been in dispute, and various other criminal figures who might have benefited from the removal of such dominant players in Essex's criminal landscape. Forensic examination of the Range Rover and the crime scene at Workhouse Lane provided some evidence, but the investigation was hampered by the fact that the murders had been carried out with considerable professionalism. The shotgun cartridges recovered from the scene were of a common type, which would be difficult to trace, and there were no witnesses to the actual killings given the isolated location where they had occurred. However, a breakthrough in the investigation came through Darren Nichols, the criminal associate who had been working as a driver for Tucker's organization in the months leading up to the murders. Nichols had been questioned by police shortly after the killings as part of the routine process of interviewing known associates of the victims, and initially he had provided no useful information. But in the months that followed, Nichols found himself facing serious criminal charges unrelated to the Rettendon murders, including conspiracy to commit robbery. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, Nichols made contact with police and offered to provide information about the murders in exchange for a reduced sentence and entry into a witness protection program. By early 1996, Nichols had become a police informant and began providing detailed information about what he claimed were the circumstances surrounding the killings. According to Nichols' account, the murders had been carried out by two men, Michael Steele and Jack Holmes, both of whom were known criminal figures in Essex. Nichols claimed that he had been present during planning meetings for the murders and had even driven Steele and Holmes to the vicinity of Rettendon on the night of the 6th of December 1995, though he maintained that he had not been present at the actual killings and had not known that murders were about to occur. Michael Steele, who was born in 1954, was a criminal with an extensive record including convictions for drug trafficking, violence, and firearms offences. He had been involved in organised crime in Essex for many years and had connections to various criminal networks in the region. Steele was known to have had disputes with Tucker and the Essex boys over drug-dealing territory and other criminal matters. Jack Holmes, who was born in 1960, also had a lengthy criminal record, including convictions for drug offences and violence. Like Steele, Holmes had been involved in Essex's criminal underworld for years and was known to police as a serious and dangerous criminal. He had worked as a cannabis cultivator and dealer and had connections to various criminal organisations in the southeast of England. The information provided by Nichols led to the arrests of Steele and Holmes in May 1996. Both men were taken into custody and charged with the murders of Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe. They denied any involvement in the killings and maintained their innocence throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. The case against Steele and Holmes rested heavily on Nichols' testimony, though prosecutors also presented circumstantial evidence, including telephone records, which placed the defendants in the general area of Rettendon at the time of the murders. Forensic evidence linking Steele to the shotgun cartridges used in the killings, and testimony from other witnesses about threats and disputes between the defendants and the victims. However, the case was not without significant problems. Nichols was a career criminal with an obvious incentive to provide testimony which would secure him a reduced sentence and protection, and the defense argued vigorously that his account was unreliable and had been fabricated to serve his own interests. The forensic evidence was challenged as inconclusive, and the telephone records proved only that the defendants had been in the general vicinity of Rettendon, not that they had been at the specific location where the murders occurred. The trial of Steele and Holmes began in January 1998 at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. The proceedings lasted several weeks and generated extensive media coverage, with detailed reporting on the evidence presented by both prosecution and defense. Nichols' testimony formed the centerpiece of the prosecution case, and he spent several days being examined and cross-examined about his account of events. The jury deliberated for several days before returning guilty verdicts against both defendants on the 20th of January, 1998. Steele and Holmes were convicted of the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, and Craig Rolfe, and were sentenced to life imprisonment with recommendations that they serve minimum terms of at least 25 years before being eligible for parole. Both men immediately began the process of appealing their convictions, arguing that the verdicts were unsafe due to the unreliability of Nichols' testimony and the weakness of the forensic evidence. Multiple appeals were lodged over the years that followed, including appeals to the Court of Appeal and attempts to have the case reviewed by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. But all of these efforts were rejected and the convictions were upheld. Despite numerous appeals and persistent claims of innocence from both men, the convictions have stood, and Steele and Holmes remain in prison to the present day. Though debates about the safety of the convictions and about whether the true killers were ever identified continue among those familiar with the case. In the aftermath of the Rettendon murders and the convictions of Steele and Holmes, Essex's criminal landscape underwent significant changes. The removal of Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe created a power vacuum in the county's drug trade and nightclub security operations, and numerous individuals and organizations attempted to fill the void left by the Essex boys. However, none achieved quite the same level of dominance which Tucker and his associates had enjoyed at their peak. The drug trade itself continued unabated despite the high-profile murders and prosecutions. Ecstasy remained popular throughout the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, though the rave culture, which had provided such fertile ground for the Essex boys, gradually evolved into the more commercialized club scene of the late 1990s. Other drugs, particularly cocaine, became increasingly prevalent as their prices fell and availability increased. Essex police continued to target organized crime in the county with varying degrees of success. The convictions in the Rettendon case were held up as an example of effective law enforcement, though critics noted that the removal of one criminal organization simply created opportunities for others to emerge. Drug-related crime in Essex remained a significant problem well into the 21st century, though the extreme levels of violence which had characterized the era of the Essex boys became less common. The story of Tucker, Tate, and Rolfe also achieved a significant cultural legacy. In 2000, a film titled Essex Boys was released, depicting a fictionalized account of the rise and fall of the gang and the events leading to the Rettendon murders. The film, while taking considerable liberties with the actual facts of the case, introduced the story to a much wider audience and established the Essex boys as iconic figures in British crime folklore. This was followed in 2007 by Rise of the Foot Soldier, a film which told the story from the perspective of Carlton Leach, a football hooligan turned doorman who had been associated with the Essex boys. The film was considerably more violent and explicit than its predecessor and proved commercially successful enough to spawn multiple sequels over the years that followed. These films, along with several books written about the case, ensured that the story of the Essex boys remained in the public consciousness long after the murders themselves. The death of Leah Betts, which had occurred just weeks before the Rettendon murders, also left a lasting impact. her family became prominent campaigners for drug education and harm reduction, and her image was used extensively in anti-drug campaigns throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The tragedy served as a reminder of the human cost of the drug trade, which had made Tucker and his associates wealthy. Meanwhile, Essex itself has undergone considerable transformation since the 1990s. The county's population has continued to grow, reaching over 1.8 million people by the 2020s, while economic development has brought increased prosperity to many areas. The towns and cities, which were once centres of the rave scene, have evolved, with many of the venues which operated during the Essex Boys era having closed or changed ownership. Crime statistics for Essex show significant improvements compared to the early 1990s. While organised crime continues to exist in the county, the levels of violence and the brazen nature of criminal operations during the Tucker era have diminished. Modern policing methods and increased resources dedicated to tackling organised crime have made it considerably more difficult for criminal organisations to operate with the same impunity which the Essex Boys enjoyed for several years. However, debates about the Rettendon murders continue. Some observers have questioned whether Steele and Holmes were truly responsible for the killings, pointing to the reliance on testimony from Nichols, whose credibility remains disputed, and suggesting that other individuals or organizations may have been involved. Alternative theories about who ordered or carried out the murders continue to circulate, though no evidence has emerged which has led to any reconsideration of the convictions. The story of the Essex Boys raises questions about the nature of organized crime, the impact of drug prohibition, and the consequences of a lifestyle built on violence and intimidation. Tony Tucker and his associates were complex figures who emerged from working-class backgrounds in a region of England which was undergoing rapid social and economic transformation. Tucker grew up in Basildon, a new town which had been hastily constructed to house London's overspill population, in an environment characterized by limited opportunities, social deprivation, and the breakdown of traditional community structures. The deindustrialization of Britain under successive governments in the 1980s created high unemployment and economic hardship for many young working-class men, particularly in areas such as Essex. It could also be argued that Tucker and the Essex Boys were simply meeting a market demand which existed regardless of their participation. Young people in Britain in the late 1980s and early 1990s wanted to attend raves and consume ecstasy, and if Tucker had not supplied these drugs, then other criminal organizations would certainly have done so. The rave culture was a genuine social phenomenon which brought pleasure and memorable experiences to hundreds of thousands of participants, and the drugs which fueled this culture were being consumed voluntarily by adults making their own choices. However, the reality is far grimmer. Tucker built his criminal empire through systematic violence and intimidation, which terrorized not only rival criminals, but also ordinary business owners, venue operators, and anyone else who stood in his way. The numerous individuals who were assaulted, threatened, or otherwise victimized by Tucker and his associates included doormen who were simply trying to earn a living, business owners who refused to pay protection money, and rivals who were often subjected to extreme and gratuitous violence. Moreover, the drugs which made Tucker and the Essex Boys wealthy caused significant harm beyond the immediate profits they generated. Leah Betts was only the most high-profile victim of the ecstasy trade, but there were numerous other young people who suffered adverse effects from drugs sold through networks which Tucker controlled. The cocaine which Tucker himself consumed in such quantities, and which he also sold to others, is a highly addictive substance which has destroyed countless lives. The violence which Tucker employed to build and maintain his criminal organization contributed directly to making Essex, and Medellin in particular, centers of criminal activity, where intimidation and fear were used to silence witnesses and prevent law enforcement from functioning effectively. Once Tucker and his associates were removed, whether through their murders or through subsequent police operations against organized crime, the communities in which they had operated began to recover. Consequently, while Tucker might have portrayed himself as simply a businessman operating in an unregulated market, or as a product of his environment who had limited legitimate opportunities, the reality was very different. Tucker chose a path of violence and criminality which caused immense harm to individuals and communities, and his death, like those of his close associates Tate and Rolfe, was a direct consequence of the violent world which he had helped to create. What do you think of Tony Tucker and the Essex boys? Were they simply products of their environment who filled a market demand? Or were they violent criminals who terrorized communities and destroyed lives for personal profit? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.